I hope you're enjoying my YouTube channel, Rick Surowicz Watercolor. If you haven't already, be sure to sign up for my mailing list so you can stay current on the latest information about my videos, online courses, workshops, coupons, and giveaways. To sign up, click the link in the top right corner. This is the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Fall Cascade. The photograph on the right was a reference for this painting. You can tell that I wanted my interpretation to be more painterly and less of a literal description of the photograph. I did a pencil sketch using a B pencil on a quarter sheet 11 by 15 inches of 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. I've drawn the major shapes and a lot of the smaller leaf shapes. Before I go any further, I'll review the colors that I used in this painting. Cadmium yellow light, gamboge, quinacridone gold, alizarin crimson, quinacridone coral, pyrrole red, royal blue, sap green, and raw umber. Rather than paint each leaf individually to begin, I'm going to apply a large fluid wash. I'm working wet on dry. I'm using a round wash brush. This is a jumbo round small synthetic squirrel blend. It's very soft, but it puts down a nice wash. So I'm letting this initial wash just go from the leafy shapes from one right onto the other. I'm looking at it as more a large shape of large mass of leaves rather than looking at them right now as each as individual leaves. I should also mention that I'm working at an incline. My board is tilted at about a 15 to 20 degree angle, and working with gravity helps achieve a nice gradation in my wash. The colors that I'm using here are a combination of the cadmium yellow light, gamboge, quinacridone gold, and then there's some quinacridone coral mixed in. So I'm letting all those colors work together to give me a variety of gradated colors throughout this wash. While I've applied this initial wash wet on dry, the paper is saturated where I've put the paint, and now I'm coming back into it and I'm working wet on wet. So this mixture here has a bit more quinacridone coral in it. It has more of a reddish tone. And these brush marks have some hard edges, which I don't want at the moment. I want this to be more of a foundation wash with softer edges. And it's this stage that gives it more of what I call the personality of watercolor. You have this nice flowing gradation of color throughout the page, and it's hard to get that with any other medium. If you wanted, you could have began working wet and wet. You could have put down a clear wash of water and then come in with some of these colors, and you get this nice gradation of color throughout. That's just another way to approach it. I'm going to continue to work in the leaf shapes with them being in a saturated condition by adding some more color. So a little stronger mix, pretty much pure quinacridone coral. And here I'm just going to splatter some of that in there just to give a little bit of a pattern that suggests some of the variation of color, that coloration as these leaves change in the fall. Now I'm going to begin to put a wash of sap green on the left side here, and I'm also going to put it on the right too. So on either side of this tree shape, I'm going to start to work in some of the sap green. And when you look at the photograph, you have this big area of green that's all around it. However, I'm going to take a more vignetted approach to my composition, so that this green isn't going to fill the page. In fact, there's going to be a lot of white showing in my finished painting. I'll use this variation of color and use these green tones to help define some of the edges on, in particular, the tree shape. And I'm going to put some of this sap green on the other side, again, to help define some of the edges here, and I use the spray bottle to soften the edges and to help create direction. I want to create this feeling of motion that's cascading from the top left corner more towards the lower right. So I'll use color. I'll use my brush strokes. I'll use my spray to help get that paint flowing in that direction. And I'll come back later with some linear marks to help enhance that feeling of directional flow. The tendency when painting this type of subject is to paint objects, individual leaves, tree, sticks, branches, as individual objects, instead of taking this more fluid painterly approach where I'm looking at large shapes of color here, and I'll come in and I'll detail some of the edges on these individual leaf shapes later, or the stems, the sticks, the branches. I'll do that as my painting evolves. But you can certainly take that approach where you come in and take almost a botanical or photorealistic approach. That's just not the interpretation that I'm after for this painting. What's going to make this painting work or not work is how I use my values and how I define edges. It's going to be important that I pull these smaller shapes out of these large washes so that you can recognize what they actually are, a leaf or a branch or the side of the trunk of the tree. So right now I'm coming in with some dark values here. And this is a mixture of raw umber with a little bit of alizarin crimson in it, so it makes it a dark, rich, warm brown. So I put that value down, and I've taken my spray bottle and softened that edge and helped diffuse that color a little bit, so it gradates the value of that wash that I put down. And now I'm working around some of these shapes, and this dark value is going to help define the edges on some of these smaller shapes. And as I work, I like to diffuse the color and soften the edges. So you can see that starts to gradate that value from dark to light. You can also just use a clear water and a brush to do that, but I like the way that the spray diffuses that color. And now I'm coming back in doing some wet and wet brush work. So when I started again with this dark value, I had dried my paper. So I was working wet on dry. But after I hit this spray on here now, any brush strokes I apply after that will be working wet on wet. So I'm using a saturated brush here on saturated paper. And I can't stress enough how important it is to have an understanding of moisture content if you're going to work with watercolor. You need to know how the paint is going to behave under different conditions with your paper and your brush. Without that knowledge, it's very hard to get the paint to do what you want it to do when you want it to do it. Now I put that wash down initially over all these leaf shapes, and now I'm bringing in this darker value and I'm working around the outer edge, or what's normally referred to as negative space. I like to refer to it more as positive and negative edges because I feel a shape can be both positive and negative at the same time. It's more about how it relates to another shape. When two shapes come together and there's an overlap there, you start to get positive and negative relationships. So I'm working on the negative edge of some of these leafy shapes with this dark value. And the mixture that I'm using, as I said, is a combination of raw umber with some alizarin crimson. But I'm also using a cooler mixture, which is made with raw umber, alizarin crimson, and a bit of royal blue in it to help darken it and cool it down. When I'm doing finer brush work in some of these stages here, a lot of times I'll use this quill brush I like to use because it holds quite a bit of paint but gives me a nice point. So I can do a lot of brush work without reloading. Sometimes if you're working with a real small brush, it gives you a nice point, nice detail, but you have to reload your brush a lot. And with this quill brush, I find out I don't have to do that as much. I can just walk around my composition and do some of this detailed brush work without having to keep going back to my palette. So this is a very dark value, and a lot of this brush work that I'm doing right now, I'm making some of these small marks that help to define edges of some of these other shapes. So where leaves intersect, I like to put a small dark shape. It starts to define that intersection, starts to define the relationship of those shapes coming together, and the edge that's the result of that. So here you can see just a little mark, just enough to start to describe the edge of that leaf. At this point, I'm not doing any more painting on the leaf. What I'm doing is working in the area around the leaf, and by doing that, I help describe some of these leafy shapes themselves by working in negative space. There's a branch here that comes off to the left, so I'm going to take some of that dark mixture that I've been using and just give an indication of that branch. And there's overlap that occurs. There's things going over top of it, so I break it up just to suggest that there's some other things going over top and overlapping that. And I'm going to put in some other branch shapes here. These are linear shapes. One of the things that you can do when you're working with line and some linear shapes are very good at helping indicate direction, create a feeling of direction. I think a lot of times the use of line gets overlooked because it can be a powerful design element. Now I want to strengthen the intensity of some of the color on these leaf shapes. So I'm coming back over top with the same colors that I'd used earlier, but my mixture has more pigment in it. So when I mix this on my palette, earlier I had a lot more water. Now I'm making a mixture that has much more pigment in it, so I'll have more intensity in the wash that I'm putting down. So the chroma will be stronger. Here I've put a touch of alizarin in with my quinacridone coral to make a much stronger, deeper, cool red tone. And as I put some of these colors down, I still want to soften the application up a little bit and diffuse that color a little more. So I'll put this wash down and I'll come back with the fine mist spray, and I'll diffuse some of that color and let it run on the page. But still working with the same combinations of the quinacridone gold and the quinacridone coral and gamboge. And here's a stronger red tone on that leaf. And now I'm going to soften that, and just more importantly, I'm going to diffuse some of that color and let it run. I like it. I think it's very interesting, and it helps carry that feeling of watercolor forward. Here I've dried my paper again, and now I'm going to take some of this red tone, and I'm going to give the indication of some of the segmentation in the leaves, some of where the veins run through and the patterns that are created on the leaves. So this is a little bit finer brush work that I'm doing. So I'm just making a mark, and I leave a little bit of gap so that lighter tone that was applied earlier comes through. And then I start to get this pattern with these red tones on the individual leaves themselves. And it not only helps define that structure of the leaf, but it also helps define some of the edges. And I'm not going to be doing this to every leaf. Sometimes the old saying that less is more. It's just enough to give a suggestion of some of these patterns on the leaves and the structure of the leaves. And I don't have to render each leaf identically. But it's more in the area where I'm trying to draw the viewer in. And it's where I'm going to have a little bit more detail, some stronger contrast. And in this case, this pattern of these red tones to help draw some attention to that area. And as I paint some of these, I still like to put just a slight mist over top. It just helps dissolve the edge a little bit here and there. I'm not trying to move the pigment or really too much or diffuse that color as much. I'm just trying to let some of those edges dissolve a little. It's the best way I can describe it. Put a little bit more here up on this leaf, some stronger contrast. So this mixture is pretty much quinacridone coral with a little bit of alizarin crimson in it. And I'm just using at the moment, a number 4 round sable brush. I want this area that I'm working in right here to have a little bit of more of this this darker tone. I don't want that light area there as it is right now. So I'm bringing in a mixture with the raw umber, some alizarin crimson, and a little bit of royal blue in it. And you can see that I softened that with the spray bottle. But I'm just continuing that darker value, kind of rich brown wash down to indicate a larger area of the tree. It was getting lost a little bit there as it was pretty much the white of the paper, so I wanted that to be darker in that area, and I'm going to bring that down a little bit more. Next, I'm bringing in a darker mixture of the sap green, so I want to have some darker values on the left side here on the edge of this tree. So I'm bringing in some shapes, and this wash has sap green, some pyro red. The pyro red helps tone the green down, and then a little bit of royal blue in it to help darken the value of that mixture. And I continue to use that technique where I use the bottle to help soften the edge and diffuse the color and let some of that run. So I'll put this wash down here, and I have some hard edges, but then I'll take that spray on the other side and I'll soften it so I get a combination of soft and hard edges. And I want this darker value to kind of help lead you from the top left, and I'll bring that behind the tree out on more towards the right side, even stretching across the page a little bit towards the bottom right to help reinforce that cascading motion. So sometimes there where I'm spraying, I'm trying to be very intentional with the direction that I'm moving the pigment. As I mentioned at the start, I want my interpretation here to be more of a painterly quality than a literal interpretation or translation of the photograph. I'm not painting realistically, so sometimes, like I say, have the courage to interpret your subject in a creative and artistic manner. Don't just try and copy photographs. Think about how you're communicating your subject to your viewer using shape, line, texture, color, value, direction. These are the design elements, the tools we have to communicate to our audience. I've dried my paper completely, and now I'm going to take a damp brush. It's not saturated. It's damp, but it has a sharp edge. This is about just under a 1/2 inch nylon brush, and it's an angle brush, and I'm using that to lift some pigment off my painting here, and it creates some interesting linear direction, some line. So I like to take this and do some lifting and create some of these linear design elements that help reinforce the direction, and they give me some additional shapes to work with. Once I put these lines down, I'll work on either side of them, strengthening them, because once I lift, you can only lift so much, but I can come in with darker values on either side of that mark that I've lifted off and strengthen that shape itself by working off its edges with darker values. I normally wait to the latter stages of my painting to do this, because if the values aren't dark enough, there's not enough contrast to really have an impact when you're lifting like this. But when you have some darker values down, or dark middle values, you have enough contrast to see this line that you're lifting, and then you can work with that as you continue to build your values and work in smaller details. Now I'm taking a darker valued mixture of a cool red. I have some alizarin with a little bit of royal blue in it, and I'm just making some dark shapes, some smaller dark shapes that help define some of the edges of right now some of these leaf shapes. So as I continue to move through my process, I start to work with darker values. I use smaller brushes and smaller shapes, a lot of times harder edges. So I'm making marks here to help describe some of the edges on some of these shapes. That pushes the area behind back and helps bring that leaf shape forward. So there's a combination of working with positive and negative as I develop this painting. When I'm making marks like this, there's a purpose in each mark that I'm making, and these aren't just arbitrary. It's normally an edge I'm trying to describe, or I'm trying to go darker with a value and increase the contrast, or I'm trying to push an area back and bring another area forward. What I don't want to do is just keep making marks because I think I'm not done. If you don't know why you're making a mark, you shouldn't be making the mark. Now I've switched back to my quill brush, and I'm using some of this dark valued mixture. This is the raw umber with some royal blue and alizarin crimson in it. And I'm just doing some of the finer brush work that I'll do in this, some of the very small shades, very dark values. Again, trying to reinforce some of the edges, trying to push some areas back with a darker value, trying to bring other areas forward. And I'll just move around my composition, making some of these brush marks where I feel that can help. Here I've carried some of that brushwork down to some of these lower leaf shapes. Again, help sharpen some of the edges. And sometimes it doesn't take just but a small mark to help define an edge. At this point, sometimes it gets almost colorgraphic, where I'm just doing little dots and dashes and just little marks here and there. I want to carry a darker value into some of these areas where I've been using sap green. So I'm putting a dark middle value wash. And here you can see is a good example of how I'm painting around an area where I had lifted out with my damp brush earlier. So I have that line. And now I'm painting on either side of it to help strengthen the contrast. And here's another one where I had lifted out, and now I put a darker wash on the edge of it, and that helps strengthen that linear shape that was started by doing some of that lifting earlier. And I'm going to work around some of those marks as I fill in with a dark middle value here, and it helps make it a lot more interesting with some of those linear twigs and branch shapes moving through and behind. Here I'm going to move to the other side. That same dark green value and middle value needs to carry to the other side here. It doesn't just stop behind that tree. So it helps that eye follow that dark green from the left side to the right side. But it's not going to be the same shape on the right side as the left side. I've got a larger percentage of the left side of that tree covered, and as I come to the right, it's going to almost vignette. And this is another opportunity to strengthen some of these other shapes by painting around the negative edge of that shape, the exterior edge of the shape. And there's some more areas where I lifted, and I'm going to paint on the edge of it and strengthen that linear shape. Here I still like to diffuse, even at this stage, some of those marks that I put down, and soften the edge and diffuse the color. At first I put down a light green wash in some of these areas, and then I put it down a middle value wash. But now I'm coming back with some of the darkest darks using some of the green tone. So this is a combination of sap green with some pyro red and some royal blue in it to really darken the value. And you can see I'm making just some small dark shapes, some linear marks, helping define some shapes, helping define some overlap, and giving a suggestion of some of these marks going behind other shapes. But it carries that dark value activity that I've got on the tree around the leaves. It carries it further out into my composition. You can't forget that your composition needs to take into consideration the entire frame of reference of your paper. You don't want to have everything floating in the middle and feel like it's floating in space without it being tied to an edge. Even on the right side here where it starts to vignette, I'm taking some of that color and I'm touching the edge. I'm touching really on all four edges, even though this is a vignette. So this design, this activity, these shapes that I'm making, you want to carry to the edge. So some of these linear marks, you don't want to just stop them all floating in the middle. And I'm going to take more and more, and so I'm going to take that right to the edge. So it feels like the entire paper is being worked as a composition. Now I'm going back to the other side. I'm taking some of that dark value again and taking it right to the edge. This is why you have to think shapes. You can't just focus on painting things. You have to, if you're going to develop a composition, it's about large shapes, small shapes, different size shapes. You have to think about not just the objects, but the space in between objects and around objects, and shadows being cast. There's so much going on in a painting. You can't just think about painting individual things. Here I have a number 1 rigger brush. Got kind of a dark middle value, and I'm making some more of these linear marks. I'm giving the feeling that it's going on, starting on one edge of something and coming out on the other edge. That helps reinforce the feeling of overlap and help create depth. And I also, by the brush strokes that I'm putting down, help to create some direction and add to the directional flow that I'm trying to create in my painting. You can see as I make these brush marks, I often stop and lift it and then pick it up on the other side of another shape. That just helps create overlap, helps create depth, helps create interest. And it also is a good way of defining edges. By starting on one side, picking up, coming on the other, that dark value helps describe, it can help describe an edge. But you do want to be aware of the direction of these marks as you're making them, and make sure they complement the activity that you already have going on. And here I'm going to frame this up with a white mat so you can get a good look at it. And there's my painting, Fall Cascade. Think about how you interpret your subject and communicate it to your viewers. And as I said, have the courage to not just copy photographs, but use the design tools we have available to us, the elements of design, to express your interpretation to your audience. Be sure to sign up for my mailing list so you can receive the latest updates about my videos, online courses, workshops, coupons, and giveaways. The link is in the top right corner and in the description. If you're looking for a more in-depth learning experience, be sure to check out my online learning center where you'll find the current courses that I have available. You can find a complete listing of my materials on the studio page of my website, rsurowiczart.com. And if you have specific questions, you can email me at contact@rsurowiczart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.